Thank you. And in the interim, also, I'll just say broadly, epistemic injustice, which we'll focus on today, and which the primer was on. Oh, thank you so much. Um, is relatively young in the philosophy world, but I actually think that it's something that teachers have a lot more experience in, and talk about all the time. So I'm going to run through briefly in sort of 10 minutes some of the foundations of the concepts in this, as well as places that epistemologists tend to apply these concepts. But I'm really more excited to hear your thoughts, and your ideas around this topic and learn from all of you. Um, yeah, share. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Okay, perfect. All right. So like I mentioned, so in the next few minutes, I'm just gonna take the next 10 minutes or so to set up discussion through two things. One is to overview the sort of mechanics of epistemic injustice. So what is it and how broadly does it tend to happen? Um, but then two, there's like lots of different types of epistemic injustice and things happening in the subfield. So I'm also just going to carve out a few starter avenues to apply these concepts that came up in the primer or that might be interesting to students to start to open things up for us to discuss all together. Sound good? Okay. So what do we or can we mean when we talk about epistemic injustice? So to try to get into this, I want to start first at kind of the conversational level, right? When we talk about injustice, we often are talking about kind of a few things that might be happening. The first is someone might be wronged as a person, right? So you might be wronged as, a human being who, is trying to live a good life, right? Like your personal well-being, your flourishing, and so on. Um, and so wronged and have an injustice committed to you against that. You also might be wronged as a citizen, right? So you you have certain rights as an equal citizen within a shared society or democracy. And so you can be wronged in the capacity of those rights, or for students, they might be wronged in the sense of, as they develop civic skills for their future civic participation and so on. But teachers know, maybe better than anyone, that there's also something else to be looking out for, and that's worries about being wronged as a learner, which is to say that you as a person have lots of knowledge that you're trying to share, and you're also trying to learn other things from other folks and their knowledge sets. And you could be wronged in that capacity, in sharing or trying to learn from other people around you. And so when a wrong is committed that way, an injustice happens in that vein, we call that an epistemic injustice. And here I'm just going to refer to epistemic sort of widely. Epistemic means like injustice related to sort of knowledge, understanding, and belief writ large. So epistemology overall is knowledge, understanding, and belief, or the study of. And then epistemic injustice is when something goes wrong, when there's like a moral wrong committed within that vein. And it matters, right? Distinguishing between these types of things, these three sets, when an injustice happens, because philosophers are going to say when we get more precise about the diagnosis, we can also be more precise about the cure, right? So let's get into a little bit about what exactly does it mean to be wronged as a knower and learner. So, to start as sort of kind of foundational building blocks of what's happening here, first, epistemic injustice scholars are, largely going to agree that people have different access to certain knowledge sets. Christy Dotson calls this epistemic resources that help us, quote, make sense of our world differently, right? So, depending on the body you move through the world in, or the place or resources that you grew up with, you might have a very different access to distinct resources for understanding issues like, say, sexual harassment, police brutality, accessible living, and so on, right? And this might seem like pretty intuitive to a lot of folks here in the room, because especially for teachers, imagine, for instance, all of the ways that your students' unique experiences give them, different kinds of knowledge that they bring into the classroom that make learning better, that make each class a little different, right? And that, sharpen kind of what you are learning in class all together as a group, right? Um, and so on top of that, not only do we each sort of have epistemic resources that we're sort of using to understand, and we are trying to learn other people's epistemic resource, understandings of things. On top of that, some other philosophers like Jose Medina are going to say that knowledge is just coming at us all the time from different places, right? So, you have knowledge coming at you from, say, the news, from the media, from that conversation you overheard on the subway. It's all coming at us, right? Um, and so to navigate, all of these sorts of knowledge, so constantly knowledge is coming at us. Some is going to, feel really intuitive to us. Some is going to be really surprising, and so on. We're navigating all of this knowledge happening and moving around, and so we rely on each other to sort of navigate all of this swarming knowledge, to share our thoughts. We count on others to hear our thoughts and to share their own, and to do so, with respect, with us as, equivalent knowers to them. And together, as we sort of rely on each other to know and share things, um, it's how we understand our world, right? At all, and maybe a little better all the time, right? Um, but of course, these exchanges can go wrong at the same time. We're not, just machines inputting and outputting knowledge in the same way. And knowledge isn't simply like the same sort of, nugget and information that we get in and get out and treat in the same way. There are lots of different ways that this could go wrong, but the sort of way that it can go wrong that epistemic injustice folks are often worried about is when it goes wrong because, or in part because, we live in an unequal and unjust society. So this is what makes the injustice component of epistemic injustice. So mainly that the what went wrong is related to what Dotson calls pernicious ignorance, as mentioned in the primer. Um, or more simply, like some what went wrong relates to broader system level injustices that are happening outside the exchange, right? So for instance, not all information is perfect, unbiased, or the same, right? So some sets of knowledge will be more common in what Medina calls kind of the social imaginary, so like media, the news, pop culture, etc. And so epistemic and justice scholars tend to call this sort of dominant identities, epistemic resources. And so if you have a dominant identity too, you're more likely to, though won't always, experience less friction when something interacts with you that matches with your identity, right? You're not surprised, it sort of bounces smooth off of you. But others will be less common in the social imaginary, so that's kind of non-dominant identities. And likewise, for your non-dominant identities, you're more likely to, though won't always, experience a little more friction when you interact with something from the dominant set, right? So that's a little bit too brief of an overview, but just to sort of get us again with the like basic mechanics. And like I said before, since we want to, be able to learn and exchange knowledge with the people around us, epistemic and justice scholars want to say that this sort of friction is a good thing. It's good for us to get exposed to new ideas and experiences, to test ideas and change our minds, and to learn new things outside of ourselves. And it helps us to do that thing that we want, right? To reciprocally learn from others, share our own experiences, and so on, and even in a way that counteracts these sort of underlying inequalities and forces. But we know, especially in education, that facing this friction is really hard. It doesn't always happen, and when it does happen, it doesn't always happen well. And so epistemic injustice, broadly speaking, is concerned with this. That is, when someone is wronged, as Miranda Fricker calls it, in their capacity as a knower. This can happen in a range of ways, on a range of levels, but some sort of broad dimensions to keep an eye on. So you can imagine that this happens at the individual level. So, for example, someone is seen as less credible than they ought to be for prejudicial reasons. And it can also happen at a macroscopic level, what's gone wrong with our information systems in general and how we interact with them, right? So epistemology has so much to say about this, and there are just far more articles that I could possibly fit in here that are fabulous, and that I definitely encourage you to get into. But just to carve out a few potential avenues that I think could be especially relevant to folks here or of interest to students. So one is the avenue of epistemic injustice has a lot to say about how we can better engage with each other as people who know and want to know things. So this is both keeping an eye on sort of what can go wrong, and then also how do we resolve these problems. So examples of this include testimonial injustice, which is mentioned in the primer, as well as intellectual haughtiness, right? When knowers aren't treated with equivalent respect, or when prejudicial biases influence how knowledge gets treated. Another avenue that epistemic injustice scholars have a lot to say about is how do we engage responsibly within challenging epistemic environments. So some examples of this include, for instance, contributory injustice. So Christy Dotson talks about this in the sense of how, if you are trying to contribute, non-dominant epistemic resources, and then, a dominant listener sort of denies you from doing so, how that's an injustice because you don't get to share and contribute and revise this sort of community knowledge together. And then also, there's been sort of more recent, broader work on social media and epistemic injustice. So Nguyen has recently released, he had a talk on hostile epistemology, for instance, which is like how do we sort of navigate and act um, virtuously, or what does it mean to act as virtuous epistemic agents within terrains that are sort of designed to be hostile to healthy, knowledge exchanges. And so again, a lot of these concerns are probably going to sound really familiar to not only, things that come up when you're talking about how to improve how we learn, but also just around sort of like kitchen table questions and conversations. But again, that's going to be a good thing because I think that philosophy, for me personally, is kind of at its most exciting when it's really applied and close to explaining and helping us put language to thorny things on the ground. And then our experiences can help revise and sharpen our philosophy and so on. Um, so that's sort of the brief, like 10-minute overview of the mechanics. And then I'm really excited to get into the discussion of what concepts stood out to you, what applications feel most fruitful, and anything else that comes to mind. So thank you again for listening and having me. And I can't wait to hear from all of you.